Welcome, everyone. My name is Joanna Regal. I am welcoming you on behalf of the I-95 Corridor Coalition to the Connected and Automated Vehicles webinar, Regulating the Unknown, Balancing Safety and Promoting Innovation. We are so happy that you could join us today. Just a few things to go over. The call-in number is on the screen and will remain in the chat box, 719-867-1571, along with the code. Participants are in listen-only mode throughout the webinar, so your lines are automatically muted. If you have any difficulty with the audio, you can press *6. You can reach out to Justin Ferry at 484-557-5009 for any difficulties with your web or audio application. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded and all materials will be available to participants after the webinar. You will receive a follow-up mailer following the webinar with links to where you can receive those documents. So to ask questions, we're asking that you use our chat box. Justin's already has the first entry with the call information. You can just put your question in there. If it's for a specific speaker, if you can direct it to that speaker, whether that be Joe or Greg or one of our roundtable speakers, that will be great. And the questions will be monitored throughout the webinar. We will stop after each presenter with time for questions, and then we will follow up at the end and get to as many questions as possible. At this point, I'd like to welcome Jenna Reeder from the I-95 Corridor Coalition, who is in fact our host for this morning. Thank you. Jenna?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Joanna. Everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jenna Reeder, and I lead the Connected and Automated Vehicle Program for the Coalition. And we're really excited to be bringing this conversation to you this morning on regulations around connected and automated vehicles and those technologies. We've heard over and over again from so many of our members and others in this space about how important and yet admittedly very complex this topic is. So what we've got, there we go, next slide. Okay, so what we've got for you this morning is two feature presentations lined up. First, we're going to hear from Greg Rodriguez with Stantec, who brings a legal perspective to this issue, and he's going to provide us with kind of a big picture overview of some of the issues and solutions and ideas in regulations and connected and automated vehicles. And then following that, we'll hear from Joe Segale from Vermont, who's going to share about their experience recently passing their legislation on connected and automated vehicles. And then following each of their presentations, we'll have some time for discussion or questions. As Joanna said, please put those in the chat box, and those that haven't been answered throughout the presentation, we can get to those. But then we've also made time today for a quick update from 4 of our additional members of other member states. They each have time to provide a quick update on some of their recent activities. We know how valuable it is for you to hear from your neighbors about some of these issues and what's going on. And so we're grateful that these 4 states have agreed to join us today in just giving a quick update. And after these 4 updates, we'll then have some time for further questions or discussion on some of these issues. So with that, I also wanted to, just give everyone a snapshot of who's participating with us today. We have folks registered from each of our member states up and down the corridor, and then we also have many of our other MPO members and other partners and other interested folks. So we're excited to see who's joining us today, and that we should have a good conversation. And then before we get into the presentations, I just wanted to give a quick update, or a quick overview and update of some of the CAV work we have going on in the Coalition. Our last CAV webinar was actually it was almost a year ago now, back in November. But that information is still relevant, and all the materials from that webinar focused on kind of agency roadmaps or strategic plans, and also a capability maturity model. We heard about Pennsylvania's work in that area. That's all available on our website, as well as all other CAV program materials. That we always post things on our website. You can go back and listen to old webinars and things like that. So you won't miss those. So take a look at those. But then I also wanted to just touch quickly on what we have coming up in this coming year. We're excited to be doing more in the CAV space in this coming year. So in early November, our Mid-Atlantic CAV group is going to be kicking off their first official call, and we're excited to get that group off the ground. Our New England group, which has been meeting more regularly, is going to be getting together in October in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And then the big item for the year will be a coalition-wide CAV workshop that we're planning to get on the calendar for spring 2020. So we're working on that now. Stay tuned, and we will be getting more information out. But for any of these items or other ideas you might have, we are always open to hearing from you about what you're interested in us doing. So with that, I get to introduce our two main speakers today. First, we'll hear from Greg Rodriguez. He's a mobility policy principal within the Stantec Mobility Innovation Team. And Greg uses his unique legal, regulatory, and policy experience to assist clients with the evaluation and development of policies and operational frameworks focused on the safe and effective deployment of transportation technologies into communities across the country. This includes demand-responsive mobility, autonomous and connected vehicles, dockless micromobility, and unmanned drones. And Greg also has experience working on Capitol Hill through a U.S. Senator and as a senior legal counsel at the San Diego Association of Governments. So he brings a lot of breadth and depth of experience. We're excited to hear from him today. And then after Greg, we'll get to hear from Joe Segale. He's a professional engineer and certified professional transportation planner. He's the director of the Policy Planning and Research Bureau for the Vermont Agency of Transportation. He's responsible for oversight of the agency's research, development, and technology transfer program and the planning and policy development to guide agency spending, decision-making, and effective resource management. He's got more than 25 years of public and private sector experience in transportation and development, and prior to joining VTrans, he worked as a consultant serving clients that included municipalities, regions, states, and developers. So welcome both Greg and Joe, and thank you again for your time today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg to get us started on the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jenna, and good morning, everybody. I do want to give a great thank you to Jenna for her great leadership in promoting the coordination and learning around a complicated and exciting issue. And I think the slide that she put up showing the different participants on this call is really exciting to see. I'm a big believer in that there are far more questions and answers in this space right now. And so doing this information sharing, having multidisciplinary participants on these calls is going to be the key to trying to figure out how do we move forward. So I'm really excited to be here today and excited for the conversation. And kind of the overall theme that I'm hoping to touch on is, like Jenna said, to provide a legal and policy perspective on where we are with regard to advanced transportation technologies and where we might be headed. And even preparing for this presentation, I put an underline under might. So I think a lot of this is up in the air right now, and that's what makes it very hard, especially for state DOTs like yourselves and local governments that are kind of the front lines with regard to the deployment of CAVs and that are expressing great interest and excitement around the technology, but also trying to figure out how do we best invest our resources and future-proof to make sure we're ready to ensure the safe and effective incorporation of these technologies on our roads. So really excited for the conversation today, and wanted to start off with kind of a federal update. And when discussing federal developments, I always like to start by referencing the Senate Commerce Committee hearing back in March of 2016. If you have not watched or read the transcripts of that hearing, I really encourage you to do so. It's kind of the place that I go back to when I feel frustrated on either things moving too quickly or maybe things not moving fast enough. And so for those of you that did see the hearing, it was called Hands Off, Future of Self-Driving Cars. And I think it shows, reading that transcript really shows why we're so interested and inspired for autonomous and connected vehicles. But it also shows how there's been very little progress made in the last 3 years, particularly on the regulatory front. So how can we move forward? That's what I've been really thinking about and working on over the last 5 years. And I think one of the challenges gets back to the title of my presentation, and that's regulating the unknown. As I mentioned, we don't know, what form AVs will take on our roadways. Is it going to be people owning them? Is it more subscription style format? What infrastructure may or may not be needed? I know the answer that we tend to hear when we have hearings on this is that no infrastructure is needed. We just need perfect lane striping, perfect signage, perfect markings on the roads. And I think that answer is overly simplistic for 2 reasons. One, even that takes money. So that gets to the one of the issues around this is how do we fund infrastructure for the future? And 2, I think it discredits the complexity that comes with level 4 and 5 vehicles. So that brings in considerations around do they also need to be connected as well? And that's why it's great that, Jenna and her conversations and kind of the focus of this group is connected and automated vehicles, autonomous vehicles, whatever you're going to call it. And again, even just using the word automated and autonomous shows the difficulty around definitions right now, and to figure out how do we move forward. And then when you think about infrastructure, is it something that we're going to need a dedicated lane for autonomous vehicles? But then if we go down that route, then we need to be thinking about equity considerations. And then how do we sell that to the public if we're going to give a dedicated lane to an autonomous vehicle? So, kind of going on different tangents there is kind of, I think, where we are. And there's a lot of interest, a lot of opportunity, a lot of challenges for getting this right. And I think it also shows how many different legal issues are involved in this. And I kind of use in some of my slides, I have a jigsaw puzzle trying to figure out how do we put it all together in the right way. And is it that we need to develop new regulations completely from scratch, or do we go in and do audits of existing regulations and figure out how to make them all work together when we're dealing with new and complicated technologies? So I think that's kind of where we are on the legal landscape. I continue to hope that we'll see more leadership from the federal government. As we know, NHTSA has put out, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has put out 2 different versions of its voluntary guidance. A lot of us are waiting for the 4th version of that guidance to come out this fall. Also, a lot of us were excited to see the ADS grant announcement last week. For those of you that may have applied but didn't win, I would encourage you not to be discouraged. I think as we saw from the Smart Cities grants that came out a couple years ago and that Columbus won, even those cities that did not win the grant still developed this great blueprint for smart cities. And I think those of you that prepared an application have this great blueprint to work from, and that what we're seeing when we're working on demonstration projects right now is that federal dollars aren't the only dollars out there. And it's going back to thinking about, and going back to Jenna's slide on all the different people on the call, thinking through new potential partnerships. How does the private sector play into this? How do the universities play into all this? And thinking really, how do you move forward with a multidiscipline approach? And kind of the last thing that I think we really need to figure out is how do we find an efficient and transparent path in updating federal motor vehicle safety standards? Because I think safety plays an important role in figuring out how do we deal with issues like liability on our roads, and perhaps most importantly, how do we make sure that we can ensure to the public that these technologies are safe for operation on our roads. And again, going back to the ADS grants, I think that's what's excited about them is because they're focused on demonstration. And I'm a big proponent of more demonstrations in controlled environments to then learn from those demonstrations and then hopefully to use data to have to actually craft the regulatory environment rather than us trying to play guessing games right now and then trying to figure out how will these vehicles operate, how do we regulate something that we don't know. I think there's a sincere danger in over-regulating, and I also think there's a danger in words like preemption or taking away state or local control because it's too early to tell. So that's kind of everything that we're balancing right now, and I think safety plays an important part in that. So this is just a slide showing all the different things that we're working on as we do statutory audits and also audits at the municipal level. Just looking through codes and trying to identify where are the potential barriers to smart mobility solutions? And, CAVs are one part of the future of mobility, but I am also involved in thinking things like microtransit. How does all this play into the world of public transportation and also micromobility? And, I always like to say, yes, those pesky dockless scooters have actually provided a great case study for some key themes, I think, that we're seeing in our reviews of codes and ordinances. And some of the themes are state versus local control, how to strike the right balance there. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of movement towards preemption or taking away the powers of local governments with regard to the regulation of new technologies. And again, I think that can be dangerous because it may actually end up stopping innovation and thinking about new ways that we can use innovation around things like alleviating congestion, rethinking how we use our limited public right-of-way more efficiently, addressing this complicated issue of potential revenue in the future. If we do have a world with autonomous vehicles operating, then there's a large chance that municipal revenues around parking are going to be reduced. And so then this gets into potentially regulating the curb and thinking about road and curb charges with regard to autonomous vehicles. And I think, to that point, I think there is a danger. Seems like there could be danger in only looking to autonomous and connected vehicles or new innovations as our only revenue source. And then a little bit I'll talk about, rethinking the value of transportation. And, I know that any sort of discussion around fees or taxes could be very politically charged, but it is kind of rethinking how we can incentivize better transportation decisions and think about how does innovation play a role in that future of transportation and hopefully promoting more sustainable use, more pooled use of transportation. And so that's where I think there is a danger of only looking to tax or implement fees on autonomous and connected vehicles. And of course, the other big issues that come up are coordination with law enforcement, data sharing, regulating increasing demand on public right-of-way, and then equity and accessibility. So that's all the things that dockless scooters are, I think, showing us right now. And I think these are all things that are playing out and moving into the discussion around autonomous vehicles. So I'd like, this slide, again, continues the discussion around some of the legal and policy issues that we've been focused on. And I like, the quote at the top, things are only impossible until they're not. I think this really gets to thinking through, how can we move forward in an effective way around regulations? And I think the challenge is trying to fit new technologies into very old laws. And I think the best example I like to use is landlines. And so right now, as we talk about wireless and broadband needs and regulations around 5G deployment, we're trying to fit them into laws that were created during a time when we had landlines. And that just doesn't seem like the right approach because hardly anybody has a landline anymore. You can see the same example for traditional vehicles. Now we're contemplating a computer, especially if it's level 4 or 5, having complete operational control of a vehicle. That doesn't necessarily fit well with our existing licensing and registration scheme. And it gets this question around, can you give an autonomous vehicle a driving test? And I think that is the question that then spills over into jurisdictional issues and what is the jurisdiction of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration? And it's not an easy question to answer. And while most states I think will say, yes, of course we can, then you have to think about, well, wait, things change when you have a computer driving a vehicle because now it is a part of the vehicle. And so arguably that computer is in charge of safe decisions related to the operation of the vehicle, and arguably safety is within the jurisdiction of the National Highway Traffic or under the jurisdiction of NHTSA. And so you just had this different world where you no longer have a human that is moving into the vehicle to operate as a separate part of the vehicle. It's now the computer that's a part of the vehicle. So again, a very complicated issue that we're working through, and then hopefully some of the findings of the ADS grants will give us more insight into, and hopefully we can move forward with a discussion around how do we update FMVSS. So, taking a step back, I know that even just talking right now, there are so many different issues that we're working on, and you can get mind blown trying to figure out, wow, how do we move forward? It seems so complicated. It's easy to become paralyzed. And that's why, again, I like to think about, okay, where have we started when looking back at that original hearing transcript, and then putting on my policy hat, how do we go back to figure out why we're doing this? And I think, capturing value, I think we truly underestimate the value of transportation. And again, that's been a big inspiration of mine of figuring out how can we use these new innovations to hopefully fill existing transportation gaps. And recently, just attending some different meetings in some Midwest cities, they talked about how there's a hidden tax of living in the city, and that hidden tax is the need to own a car in order to have access to jobs, to get healthy food, to have social interaction, and essentially to have livability. And I think, thinking about the value of transportation, it's up to us to rethink how we prioritize our use of infrastructure, how we think about new funding sources related to the future of transportation, and how are we going to essentially regulate the right-of-way as new ideas around congestion pricing and curb pricing move forward. And essentially it comes down to prioritization. And even now with the prioritization of not only infrastructure, but also thinking about the ITS component of all this, how does spectrum play into all this when you think about wireless and broadband connectivity that might be needed for vehicles? And how do we prioritize the use of that spectrum for things like safety rather than infotainment? And so again, I think it comes down to value and us really doing a better job of understanding the value of transportation and making sure that that value continues to be a priority as we move forward and think about things like economic development and planning. And I think that also brings up the connection with land use and affordable housing that a lot of states and cities are thinking about. And again, I think, a big theme that I'm hitting on today that I'm realizing is kind of the opportunities around this. And yes, we have all these challenges, but again, we have all these great minds on the phone. We have a lot of great minds working on this, and I do think it's a multidisciplinary approach to move forward. So these are all the national issues I think we need to be tracking and talking about, the role of states and cities. Data sharing is something that I'm very much involved in right now. In talking with Jenna and planning for this, I think that's its own separate webinar that I would welcome the chance of being part of. But just some quick thoughts on data. Data has tremendous value. In the meetings I'm having on data, there are different understandings of the role data plays and what its value is. So I highly recommend a workshop on this to bring as many people into the room and have a really candid discussion about how different people within your organizations view data, and to try and educate around the value of data. I also think it's important to note that data requires resources, not only for storage, but also analysis. And then data, of course, has risk, the privacy, the cybersecurity concerns that are being raised. But again, I think the value is too great not to start to invest and develop a data governance plan. And for those of you that applied to the US DOT ADS grants, you know that data was a big part of that. And then the other thing that I'm closely tracking is how is NHTSA going to move forward on the waivers that have been filed by GM with regard to its autonomous fleet that it would like to launch that doesn't have steering wheels and pedals, and also Neuro, which is doing deliveries of groceries with a vehicle that, again, doesn't fit with FMVSS. So here's a slide with some thoughts for moving forward. I think this group, again, going back to the theme of information sharing, shows the value of sharing and collaboration. But I will say, to the last point, beware no one-size-fits-all approach. works, you need to have your own vision. I really recommend that, and that requires resources and public engagement, but it's very much worth the investment so that you have a framework to work within and will be positioned when new innovations show up in your state, or you want to test. And as we already know, we're going to hear during the roundtable, which I'm excited to hear about. The DOTs on this call are doing great work. Maryland has a CAV working group where I attended meetings early on. I'm hoping to get back involved in my new role at Stantec. The Minnesota Department of Transportation recently released a CAV strategic plan, which I think is a great model to take a look at. And they're doing really great work with a focus on innovation. And the person who put that together is also an attorney. So I would put a plug in for my fellow attorneys to not exclude them from the room, but incorporate them into your conversation in a proactive way. And I promise you won't be disappointed, because lawyers do like to be creative and don't always like to say no, I promise. And PennDOT, I recently attended the AV Summit that they put on and presented, and it was really a great experience, and I enjoyed learning about all the great initiatives they're up to and all the great resources they put up on their website. So for those that haven't, I encourage you to visit that as well. So look forward to hearing more from the roundtable day and answering any questions. And this is my contact information. For those that know me, I love discussing these issues on Twitter. You know, love putting on presentations, putting together multidiscipline panels. If you're interested, reach out. And I always like to put that old cell phone and say, hey, remember where the cell phone started? It took a while to get where we are today, and so hopefully we can move forward and realize our smart mobility future that accommodates the needs of all and addresses all the challenges we're talking about today. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. So I don't see that any questions specifically for you have come in through the chat box, but Greg should have some more time at the end. So if there are those out there who have questions for him, don't be shy, stick them in there. He can either answer them through the chat box, or we can get back to those at the end. So now we will turn it over to Joe to hear about what's been going on in Vermont. Thanks, Joe.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Joe Segale from the Vermont Agency of Transportation, and I'm going to talk about the recently passed Automated Vehicle Testing Act here in Vermont and how we got there. I will say we are probably lacking an overall vision for where we want to go with connected and automated vehicles, but we felt after some talking with our legislators and other stakeholders that we should at least be thinking about getting ready for testing, because that's something that might be coming at us sooner rather than later. But I agree, and I would really love to do some more work on visioning. So I'm going to talk about the context and background in Vermont, and giving an overview of the act itself and lessons that I've learned so far. And automated vehicles testing on public roads in Vermont are going to have to deal with things like cows crossing the road potentially, and other challenges that are specific to Vermont. Our context is that there's over 14,000 miles of roads. About 3,000 of those are state highways. They're under the jurisdiction of Vermont Agency of Transportation, or we manage them. And most of the roads are under the jurisdiction of municipalities. And that was one of the challenges as we move forward with the legislation is, what's the right role of municipalities in improving the testing on local roads. And, one argument might be that, gosh, you don't need to get a driver's license or vehicle registration from every town. But at the same time, there's more risk associated with testing. And I think transparency is so important. The public really has a right to know when testing is occurring on their roads. An issue that often comes up when I'm out talking about automated vehicles around Vermont is how are they going to work on our gravel roads, or as we call them, dirt roads in Vermont, and over 8,000 miles of that, and they're ultimately those last 2 or 3 miles that people are traveling to get to and from their homes or out to farms and so on. There's obviously no lines or signs. So how will these vehicles actually work on those roads? And we have a really mud season that happens, March, April timeframe, where the roads get soft and really ruddy and difficult to even for a human who can interpret what's going on. Our highway system is is really a multimodal system, and it serves all users. And some of those photos on the right get a sense for what it's like up here. And the one photo with the traffic in it, that's probably the one location. It's in the Burlington area with the highest level of traffic in the state, and that's about as intense as the congestion gets here. But there's just a different context here, and we want to be prepared for that. So a few years ago, we started talking in the legislature about automated vehicles. And, the conversation started out sort of slowly and just as part of, for me anyway, just part of my discussion on what I was doing every year as my budget presentation. And at first there was quite a bit of skepticism about automated vehicles, but kept talking about it year after year. And then they finally asked us to say, hey, why don't you at least go out and talk to stakeholders around Vermont, find out, how they feel about this issue, and then come back to us and tell us what you found. And so we talked to people in the driver education field, emergency responders, our Legal Commission partners around the state, and we had one large meeting in conjunction with our Highway Safety Alliance meeting every year. We probably had 50 people that came and spent a few hours talking about automated vehicles and gave us their feedback. And that one of their major concerns was just how do we manage safety through the transition. I think that most people are buying the argument that in the long term these vehicles might be good for safety, but it's how do we get there. Most folks agree that we should have some sort of permitting for automated vehicles on public roads, and I know that's not really consistent across the country. There's definitely that feel like a permitting process maybe isn't necessary, but that's not the way that we're feeling here in Vermont. They recognize that automated vehicles are going to be important to Vermont's economic vitality in the long term, and we want to make sure that Vermont residents, our businesses, and really our visitors, we're surrounded, we're really close to large metropolitan areas, and tourism is a significant part of our economy, and as the technology develops, we want to make sure that people that are using that technology can come to Vermont, and especially those who maybe want to start businesses in Vermont. We've had some challenges with broadband and so on, getting that expanded around the state, and we want to try to get out ahead of this one. And so ultimately it was that we should actively prepare for automated vehicles in the state. So we submitted the report to the legislature and recommended that we develop legislation to allow and regulate the testing of AVs in Vermont. And we also initially recommended that the legislation allow for the deployment, use by the general public of automated vehicles in Vermont. And one thing, that has been really helpful to me over these last few years as I've learned about this issue is just, the participation in I-95 Corridor Coalition, and as well, working with the states in New England and those partnerships and having people I can talk to and ask questions. And, one of the big questions was, why should we allow testing in Vermont? Should we just be kind of sitting back and let it happen in other places and just kind of wait? And I don't think that there's a huge, economic opportunity from the standpoint of, a vehicle manufacturer is going to open up shop in Vermont. There might be a little bit of that happening, but it was really about just getting Vermonters, prepared for it so that the technology can come here, as soon as practical, and so that the technology understand what it's like to be in our environment, and so we can benefit from it as soon as possible. So this report was, if you look at that map that often is in presentations that show legislation that have been passed around the state, the United States, you'll see Vermont has been colored, and it was really this study. It was before we actually did the testing legislation, but now we do have testing legislation. So we had an internal bill drafting working group that included me, as well as several people from our Department of Motor Vehicle and Vermont State Police that really got into the weeds of drafting the legislation. And we relied to, a great extent just to kind of get started on AMVA's jurisdictional guidelines, which was a great checklist of the issues that we need to be thinking about. But also, and I really want to thank all the other states out there that have led the way. And, I did a lot of reading and scanning of the legislation that was out there previously and, brought in ideas from many states and tried to synthesize it into something that was appropriate for the way that we do things in Vermont and the processes that we have in place here in Vermont. And we also went out at least once to a broader stakeholder group beyond the folks that are on this list here, public transit and, people that represent folks with disabilities. There were lobbyists from different car manufacturers that came to a meeting where and Vermont League of Cities and Towns and so on, sort of the regular list of stakeholders who you might think would be involved in something like this to get their early feedback on what this legislation might look like. So, you're all familiar with this chart and different forms that it's shown, but I use this often when I'm just talking to members of the general public or others that I'm trying to educate about what we're doing. And so the AV Testing Act basically is limited to levels 3, 4, or 5. And one of the things that we learned about really quick was that's how we wrote the legislation initially. It was using the SAE levels as a point of reference. We got some great feedback from the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers that really should kind of neutralize the definition that you're using in legislation just so that it stays sort of resilient to the changes that might be happening in those SAE guidelines. And so we defined an automated driving system basically related to the functions that it provides. And if you read that definition carefully, you can connect that back that it basically covers levels 3, 4, and 5. The entire dynamic driving task on a sustained basis with its operational design domain, if any. So if it was a level 5, it may not have like a limited operational design domain. Achieving a minimal risk condition, under certain circumstances, where applicable, meaning, a level 3 does not have the ability to, a level 3 ADS does not have the ability to achieve a minimal risk condition. So while I think it was important to have this sort of functional definition in the legislation, it's not that clear. And I think, or I know when I'm talking out in the public about it, I still rely on the SAE definitions because it's just a nice, simple framework for talking through, what the Act itself is regulating, but also just, automation in general and the evolution of automation over time. So the legislation has this language, but I'm still talking about the SAE definitions because I just think they're very useful. So our testing approval process, we have the Vermont Traffic Committee, which is a long-standing committee that consists of the Secretary of Transportation, the Commissioner of the Department of Motor Vehicles, and the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, which is where the state police fall under. And that committee is charged with speed limit approvals on state highway systems, changes to parking, limited access use, and a few other things. And it just made sense that those 3 appointed officials appointed by the governor really all have safety as a part of their mission. Even though we, the Agency of Transportation, is responsible for infrastructure, DMV is responsible for the administration of vehicle registration, licensing, and so on, and state police are obviously responsible for law enforcement and safety. It just made a lot of sense for that standing committee to be ultimately the body that was issuing the permit, with lots of staff support, of course. And so the Traffic Committee is authorized to approve the testing of automated vehicles on the entire state highway system, and then also on Class 1 town highways, which town highways that are under the jurisdiction of municipalities, as well as joint jurisdiction with the Agency of Transportation, that pass through a town or city and carry a state or U.S. number route. So we wanted that continuity, because the other important part of the Act is that testing is only allowed on all other local roads in Vermont, classified as 2, 3, and 4, with the pre-approval of a municipality. So pre-approval isn't a test permit. It means that the municipality has passed a resolution saying, hey, we welcome testing on our roads, and here are some conditions that we might put on testing in advance. They aren't actually seeing a specific permit at that time, although it could happen that way. It's almost like zoning. It's kind of like saying, hey, testing is allowed in these zones. And that was like a big issue in the legislature because the original legislation, as we proposed, was the traffic committee could approve testing on all roads, period. Didn't need specific approval from municipalities, which it didn't take very long for that to be resisted and changed to the process that we have now. And so municipalities are maintaining significant control. In fact, they can withdraw their pre-approval at any time with just sending a letter to the secretary. They're not responsible for any infrastructure upgrades or any cost of the testing. So the Agency of Transportation is responsible for working with municipalities and trying to recruit some municipalities. But that's where we ended up. And the law just passed this session, and I'm putting together material now to try to inform municipalities and doing a bunch of outreach, as well as developing the permitting guidance to get municipalities on board. Some of the requirements that we have on testers are that the human operator has to be in the car at all times, be able to take over control. The initial draft of the legislation was a little bit more flexible than that, but that's where we landed. I'll say the legislators, they had a steep learning curve, but they grasped it, and they're like, they got that key policy issue. It's like, and they were not comfortable with allowing automated vehicles on the highways without someone, without a safety driver in the car. So the operator has to be at least 21 years old and pass a background check, and the blood alcohol content has to be less than 0.02, which is what's required for school buses. $5 million of liability insurance in whatever form that's provided. Vehicles have to comply with state and local traffic laws, and AV testing vehicles must be clearly identifiable. Excuse me, a little dry throat here. So my next steps are recruiting AV testing municipalities. And like I mentioned, I'm doing outreach now. And, it's until I really get the permitting process kind of nailed down, which should happen over the next several months, I'm not really expecting municipalities to jump on board unless they know what the process is. And I want to mention that when the traffic committee makes its decisions, that this is done in a public hearing format. We have to notify municipalities at least 60 days ahead of time of when that meeting is, and all the other normal public hearing notice requirements. So I'm working on the testing guidance and really, drawing heavily from PennDOT and MassDOT. They've got some great examples, and although the legislation gives me to January 2021, I'll have it done sooner than that. And this is, I've had a couple calls of people that might be interested in doing some level of testing in Vermont, really just very preliminary kind of, feeling us out kind of calls when the legislation was going through the State House. But I'm not expecting to be swamped with applications. And I think, the Agency of Transportation will probably have to take the initiative to find some partners to lead a test, some sort of test that's appropriate for us. I'm really interested how automated vehicles could, work in providing some sort of shuttle service from a very rural area into one of our small towns or small urban areas. And finally, just some lessons learned. Involving the industry early is really important, just because of the way that we develop legislation and needing the approval from the governor and so on before we move forward. I wasn't really able to get good feedback when I finally had a solid draft of the legislation ready to go. It's kind of put, it's held internally until, everybody's on board with it. And so we didn't get feedback from the industry on the details of the legislation until it was actually in the process. And, they worked very well with us in that, the committee meeting process. And, but it would have been great to get their feedback earlier, because the expertise that they had to offer was really useful, and I would have benefited from it sooner. There was a steep learning curve for legislators, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, that chart shows the learning curve going down. It wasn't really in that direction. I felt like, they really listened and really were very thoughtful about this, and they got the concepts and they got the major policy questions, and the question of, should there be a driver in the test vehicle is a good example, and a few other details that they really made the legislation better. And they were very supportive, and they want Vermont to be ready for this technology as well. And then incorporating municipal approval is, I think it's essential. And my own view initially was, gosh, open hearing process where the traffic committee is making a decision, and the traffic committee is consisting of people that are responsible for the safety of the traveling public on the highway. They're going to listen to what municipalities have to say, but it's just, it's the culture here, and I think in a lot of states about local control. And so we had a compromise, and now we have, a slightly more complicated process to go through. But, it was challenging and essential, but I feel like we got through it okay. So that's my summary. There's my email if you have any questions for me that we don't answer today, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. So we do have a question here from Kristen White. She writes, how does Vermont require the testers to comply with all state vehicle codes when so many of these AVs are unable to do so? Can you take that one for us, Joe?
I was just working on that detail yesterday, and I'm not sure I have the, absolute correct answer yet. But as I've been developing permitting test guidance and application, I stole some language from Massachusetts, really, that states that these test vehicles have to meet all the federal motor vehicle safety standards, and if they can't provide some equipment, or if they have to, if the ADS technology itself involves replacing some component of that, they would be allowed to do that on a test vehicle. As I understand it, they can't sell that test vehicle, unless they maybe restore it to its original condition. But, I will confess right now that I'm a little unclear of the whole waiver process at the NHTSA level. It doesn't sound like it's really well defined yet. And so that's a great question that I don't have a great answer for right now.
And this is Greg. I'll chime in very quickly. If you look at California's example for how it has its whole application process, in order to test an AV, you need to show that it's operated safely in a similar operational environment. So that could be some sort of testing in another place. And I'm also curious to see what the role of simulators is going to be. But I think the overall point is a good one. And the question is, how do we get some sort of verification, especially on the state or local government side, or even the federal government side of things? And so I think that gets to kind of allocation of resources and rethinking what our workforces are going to look like, and what type of staff we're going to need to be able to do everything from verification of safety requirements of autonomous vehicles to also potential verification of code if we have an interactive environment with connected vehicles as well.
Yes, we are going to require that they demonstrate that the test vehicle has been tested in some sort of simulated condition that it's similar to the operational and design domain that they're proposing in the test.
Okay, great. Thank you both for those answers, and Joe, thank you for your presentation. And to everyone on the phone, Joe and Greg will stay on and be available to answer more questions at the end, or again in the chat box as we move along. But now we'll move into the roundtable updates that we have. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we reached out to 4 of our member agencies to provide just a little more of an overview, or of a little more information about what's going on in some of these other states. We sort of asked them these 4 prompts for things they might be able to share related to regulation or other activities that they have going on that they'd like to update us on. We know that everyone's working hard on these things, updates and new and progress is happening at different rates, and it's really hard to kind of keep up with what's going on everywhere. So we're excited to be hearing from a few more states. So we've got Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia lined up to talk us through a few different things. And so with that, we will move right to Connecticut with Pete.
Thank you, Jenna.
Pete, are you there?
Good morning, everyone.
Okay.
I'm here. You hear me okay?
Good. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenna and Joanna and the I-95 Corridor Coalition for having me present this morning. My name is Pete Calcaterra from Connecticut DOT. I work in the Office of Strategic Planning and Projects. Our office pretty much deals with things that don't fit neatly into a box, this being an issue that definitely falls in that category. I was also say, in addition to the 4,000 miles of state-maintained highways that we maintain, and the 2,500 traffic signals that we also maintain statewide, we also own and operate all public transportation in Connecticut, all of the buses and passenger trains in the state. So our approach to CAV is definitely from a multimodal perspective, not just from an infrastructure owner-operator, but also from the vehicle perspective as well. I had the luxury of having my operating system updated recently, so I'm going to have to say next slide here to continue the prompt because I can't see the link, unfortunately. But the next slide should say potential benefits. So our approach to CAV, we're definitely, what excites us most here at our agency about the potential for CAV is some obvious categories, safety being one of them. Each year in Connecticut, about 100,000 people or 100,000 vehicles get in an auto crash each year, resulting in about 30,000 injuries and about 300 fatalities. So any sort of effort we can do to move the needle towards that, and this new technology is definitely a promising way to go about that. Enhancing mobility and accessibility. Aging in place is a huge issue. We have the third longest life expectancy of any state in the U.S., more than 80 years. So the ability for our senior population to age in place is key, and that population is going to continue to grow over the next few decades. Also improving last mile connections in regards to enhancing mobility and accessibility. Reducing emissions, definitely along the ACES acronym, the automated connected. The future is also not only automated and connected, but electric and shared too. And that electric piece we feel is a key piece here because about 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in our state come from the transportation sector. So anything that we can do to help move the needle on that as well would be of interest to us. And also to provide greater efficiencies for the transportation services that we provide, enabling greater and more direct travel communications with motorists on our highways, more frequent, convenient on-demand transit that can keep up with competitors like Uber and Lyft that provide that convenient on-demand service now. We're already starting to see ride-sharing have an impact on our ridership for public transit, and it's going to continue to grow or continue to decline, I should say, in that regard. And also just providing a safer, lower cost option for solutions moving forward. Next slide, please. I would say the biggest, there's many challenges with CAV, many, and endless challenges, I would say. But I would say if I had to pick one, the greatest challenge is just planning for an uncertain future. So this slide that you should see in front of you was put together by one of our consultants that compiled a lot of industry data made available out there, and it just clearly outlines there's a lot of unknown and uncertainty as to exactly when the technology for connected and automated vehicles will actually reach a large enough market share for us to make and plan decisions around. Not knowing where this is going to go or how it's going to go or when it's going to happen has an impact on our ability to prioritize and right-size the issue of CAV within our agency. Right now, you're listening to one of the few people in our agency that actually is working on this topic. We have a few others as well dispersed throughout our agency, but it's definitely not something that's right front and center in our agency at this point, mainly due to the challenges of not knowing this uncertain future here. Allocating the right amount of staff and resources, developing proper workforce skills that meet not only current needs but future needs that CAV may have, upgrading our infrastructure, same thing, to meet not only current needs that we know but the needs that we don't know in the future. Investing in future-proof technologies, 5G and DSRC are different flavors of connected vehicle technology, and we want to make sure that we're, if we go down that route, especially for pilot testing and putting different connected devices on our roadway, that we're not put into a proprietary box or a future that we're locked in to be able to adapt to future changes. Next slide, please. Some of the connected and automated vehicle activities we've been involved in over the last few years. In 2017, our state legislature passed a law that enables pilot testing, created a pilot program for automated vehicles, and created a legislative task force for autonomous vehicles. And I'll talk a little about that towards the end here, and I'll move quickly. I only have a few minutes left. We hosted 3 Northeast Regional CAV Summits. Some of you may have attended them over the last 3 years. We did that as a successful effort as a partnership with Federal Highway Administration and the University of Connecticut. And it was attended by about 250 people each year with a focus on policy, infrastructure, and technology, and we look forward to continue those types of events moving forward. We participate on a variety of different CAV working groups, pool fund studies, and consortiums. From this group, the Unidentified Corridor Coalition, AASHTO has some CAV activities. We're also part of the Connected Vehicle Pooled Fund study, and most recently are joining the Automated Vehicle Bus Consortium that's looking to build out a full spec for a full-size automated bus. I can talk a little about that too. And we're also part of Joe had mentioned a little bit about this. We have a regional group, and Jenna too, here in New England, a subset of the Unidentified Corridor Coalition that's trying to hone in on the New England aspect of CAV, and we look forward to continuing to be involved in that effort and think even sub-regionally here in New England. Next slide, please. Some other activities going on. We've been applying for a variety of grants to help fund different AV activities. We did apply for the ADS grant that Greg had mentioned, and a variety of other grants. Most recently, we applied for an FTA grant to get a full-size automated bus and put it on our fixed guideway, which is a bus-only road, about 9 miles long, connecting 2 mid-sized cities in Connecticut. We're designing a connected vehicle to infrastructure project on the road right outside of our headquarters. It's about 15 signalized intersections that we're going to be replacing and equipping with new technologies, not just DSRC, but other technologies like adaptive traffic signal control and automated traffic signal performance measures and so forth. It's a diversionary route to our Interstate I-91, and we're trying to test new traffic or new technologies that can help move traffic through when there's an incident on I-91. Connected vehicle activities is definitely part of that. And right now we're also working on drafting a CAV plan. Going back to some of those earlier slides about the future being unknown, we're taking a very much a near-term approach to this plan. Trying to highlight the need for us to continue to build our internal knowledge base and experience with CAV, building an internal structure to help coordinate activities. So it's not just a few of us, but more of a network of folks within our agency. Highlighting the importance of building partnerships, internal to our state, external to our state as well, with industry, with universities, and just remaining active in a variety of things that we're doing. Last slide here is just next steps and lessons learned. So I would say that the most immediate next steps is definitely finishing that plan. We'll hopefully have that out later this fall and make a copy available to everyone if you want to look at it. And also working with our legislative task force to update our autonomous vehicle law. So a few years ago, we had a workshop, the Unidentified Corridor Coalition had a workshop in Maryland where I was asked to present on the law that we passed. About 2 years have passed since then, and we don't have an actual pilot out on the road yet. And so one of the things we're trying to look back and why that is, and there's definitely some, I would say, overly prescriptive language perhaps in the law that we wrote, and hindsight is always 20/20. So I would say some lessons learned and some things to keep in mind if your state is considering legislating a solution moving forward. I guess try to keep a high level or a higher level as possible in terms of the actual language in that law, because the future is very much unknown and things do change, and our ability to implement and create a landscape here in Connecticut that's attractable for industry is a bit challenging given the current language of the law right now. So we'll be working with the legislature to kind of make some improvements that still walk a very careful line of ensuring safety, obviously, but also, trying to make it future-proof so we can attract more industry involvement and just be ready for deployment. moving forward. So that's all. I know I kind of probably ran over time here, so I'll just stop. And I don't believe we're doing questions after this, but at the end perhaps, right?
Yes, great. Thanks, Pete. And yeah, we'll circle back for questions for all the roundtable presenters. So next we've got an update from Katie and Ryan with the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities.
Hi, thanks so much, and thank you for having us today. My name is Katie Lubitz. I'm the director of the Transportation Network Company Division at the Department of Public Utilities. Here with me also is Ryan Hawkins, who's our Assistant General Counsel. Our division is charged with regulating PNCs like Uber and Lyft that are operating in Massachusetts. And we wanted to just provide a quick update to this group regarding some legislative developments in the area of data surrounding PNCs and how they're moving through our state. Next slide. So first, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the current statutory and regulatory framework related to PNC ride data. The statute that sort of creates the regulatory framework for TNCs was passed in 2016, and subsequently regulations were passed in 2017. Pursuant to the statute, companies are required to submit to the division the number of rides from the previous calendar year that started in each city or town, and as well as a per ride assessment of 20 cents per ride. The regulations require the companies to report to us city or town where each ride originated, the city or town where each ride ended, aggregated and anonymized trip route and length in miles and minutes, as well as the location of vehicle accidents. We've now collected this data over the course of the past 2 years since the division was formed. And I think it was really this year that there was sort of a realization that you know, it's been sort of eye-opening to see, the number of rides and the way that it's grown. So in 2017, we saw approximately 65 million rides that took place in the state. And in 2018, saw that grow about 25% to 81 million. What we also saw this year is that about half of those rides started in Boston, so about 40 million rides, and then of those 40 million, 30 million also ended in Boston. So I think there was, after many conversations with stakeholders at Mass DOT as well as regional planning agencies, there was an understanding that while this is interesting from really a planning perspective, and in order to make really data-driven decisions on policy surrounding congestion management, emissions tracking, and transportation planning, we really need a more granular level of data from these companies, just given what we know about the sheer volume and sort of the way that they're moving throughout our state. Next slide. And so to that end, Governor Baker has proposed and filed proposed legislation that would amend our existing statute and essentially enable the division to obtain much more granular information on rides and driver behavior. I've listed out sort of at a high level what these changes would be, but essentially for shared and non-shared rides, the legislation would enable the division to obtain the latitude and longitude of the start and end points, the cost paid by the rider, the driver's city and town of residence, whether the ride accommodated a person with special needs, whether the ride was provided by a wheelchair accessible vehicle, total miles and time spent driven en route to pickup, total time and miles driven while actually providing the ride, and total number of riders in the vehicle. The legislation also enables the division to obtain more detailed information on accidents, including exact location and time of day. And finally, the legislation contemplates the companies providing more detailed information regarding the ride for the purposes of congestion management. And particularly, we're looking at sort of the number of drivers using the network in certain areas during certain times of day, in addition to dwell time behavior in certain areas during certain times of day. I provided the link to the actual statutory language here. And, you know, I think that we did look to sort of other cities in terms of particularly Chicago and New York, who are getting more granular data on TNCs and how they're moving throughout their cities. I know that I think this would be sort of, you know, if this legislation does move through the process as it is, I think at a state level this would be sort of the most granular ride information that any state is obtaining. And I think that from our perspective, there's been an understanding that we do need more. Next slide. So I think that our greatest obstacle has been sort of learning that technology companies, and I think this sort of lesson is, or this obstacle is sort of pertinent when we're talking about regulations in the space of CAVs, but tech companies, I think for good reason, they guard their data very closely, and that's not only because of privacy concerns regarding consumers, but it's also because there may be, you know, they claim that in some way this data may be proprietary on some level, and it's been our experience that the companies won't provide us any more than what they are required to by law. I think that what we learned in sort of the process of drafting this proposed legislation, which included input from stakeholders ranging from our Executive Office of Technology, Services and Security, our Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Mass DOT, Massport, which runs Logan Airport, the MBTA, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. We also built into the statute sort of safeguards for this data, given just how granular it is. In the statute, we've made a provision that the division would enter into confidential data sharing agreements with certain agencies that are sort of outlined in the legislation. And then finally, from the perspective of lessons learned, I think that, and this has come up, I think other speakers have mentioned this, but in coming up with sort of the legal and regulatory framework surrounding data, I think it's very important to just include all stakeholders in sort of the critical areas: public safety, environmental affairs, transportation, and entities that run major transportation hubs like airports, because their input is critical. So our contact information is on the first slide. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions for us. But thank you again for having us.
Great, thank you, Katie. Thanks so much. I think that that topic certainly is one that's only going to become more and more important and critical as time moves on. And there is a question for you guys in the chat box from Greg Rodriguez. I'll let you, if you want to try to answer it in that chat box while we listen to the other presenters, or we can circle back to that one at the end as well. So at this point, we are ready to turn it over to our friends in Maryland.
Great. Well, thank you. Hi, this is Chrissy Neiser. I'm the administrator of Maryland Department of Transportation Motor Vehicle Administration, and I also serve as co-chair of our Maryland CAV working group that Greg mentioned. In addition to that, I'm also Governor's Highway Safety Rep, so anytime we talk about connected and automated vehicles, the safety is clearly front and center in terms of what our priorities are. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about Connected and Automated Vehicles Working Group and what we've attempted to accomplish. That's been formed since December 2015 in Maryland. It's been a very active group. We have taken the approach that really it is through collaboration and bringing partners together that we're able to learn more about these complex issues. They're are many questions, but not as many answers, and so we are definitely have a very open approach to making sure that we are listening to all perspectives before moving forward. Again, we appreciate the life-saving benefits as well as the economic benefits that the CAV technology brings, and so that is our focus in terms of our vision. We do have a very large working group, generally have about 80 attendees on a regular basis, folks from state government, local government, law enforcement, insurance industries, research entities, the AAA, and our motor truck community attends, so really a great variety of entities who come to the table and share ideas. But even more importantly, underneath that, we have our technical subgroup, which includes the various business units between the Department of Transportation. We are also a consolidated department, so we've got our port and our airport and our tolling authority, as well as our MVA and our transit administration all in one place, and so that really allows us to look at it from a multimodal perspective. So that technical subgroup looks at CAV applications that come in. They make recommendations on project ideas and technical issues, and I'll talk about our application process in a few slides. There's also a policy subgroup that we include external partners when we're trying to determine what processes should look like, what the application process should look like. We definitely included entities who are interested in testing with us so that we could get their feedback as part of developing that permit process to make sure that it made sense. We've got two subgroups that we formed, one to look at freight issues. Again, that includes our external partners from the motor truck community and various stakeholders to really look at how we can aid the movement of freight in Maryland by the use of this technology. We've also got an emergency responder subgroup, and that really has been an important component with law enforcement wanting to make sure that they feel comfortable with the technology that's out on our roads, that they understand what to look for, that they understand what to expect, and if there was an incident or a crash, that they would be well prepared because we've involved them from the beginning. So those are our two subgroups that we've provided as part of the larger working group. On the next slide, we talk about recent milestones, and so we are excited that our M.MTA was awarded the first ever CAV pilot under the TRB IDEA Transit program. That is a partnership with a Maryland woman-owned small business that has developed SAE Level 4 autonomous parking technology, and it works very simply from an app on your phone. We've been testing that at various facilities, including a BWI airport, as well as from some of our transit lots, and so that's an exciting advancement. Our State Highway Administration has been advancing the SPAT challenge along US 1, a major corridor in the Maryland area, and continues in looking at ways that we can make traffic move more smoothly in that corridor in particular. Our Maryland Transportation Authority is continuing DSRC pilot testing and very active with that. They've got 4 RSU sites established and collecting data to try to provide, make good decisions moving forward from that information. We're also fostering education within MDOT and our employees as part of the working group. We've really made interacting and experiencing either connected or automated technology a part of it. So prior to every CAV working group, we have a demonstration for those who are interested. We also have established some lunch and learns at various organizations to try to make sure that we are educating our employees and they are aware of the new developments that are coming forward. We've established a process where entities can file an expression of interest that they're interested in collaborating us on CAV activities. We currently have 21 entities who have filed one of those. Some of those are from research entities who want to work from us in that way. Some of them are private entities that want to test on our roadways that we then subsequently work through the process. But in some way, they want to get engaged in the conversation, so it's been a great way. It's right online, and they can submit information directly to us. We do have 3 companies that were issued permits for HAV demonstration testing on public roadways. Really excited about that continuing to move forward. We've not only got the automated parking technology, we're also testing low-speed shuttles at 2 different locations throughout the state, and really working to not only determine the feasibility of additional sites, but also looking at collaboration with our local governments in those areas. On the next slide, I'll further talk about the outreach to local government. So one of the members of the CA working group that I didn't mention is our Maryland Municipal League, Maryland Association of Counties. We really invited them to the table from the beginning to make sure they were part of that conversation. We've also had good interest and support from our planning organizations and engineering associations. So really trying to make sure that we're reaching out early on, sharing information with all those entities. We know that eventually, if not initially, that these testing applications will impact local government roads. And so we want to make sure that we're partnering from the beginning, sharing information, local law enforcement is involved, and making sure that everybody is comfortable with how we're moving forward. We did not want to be in a situation where local governments were issuing one permit and we were issuing another, and so really working together to make sure there's sign-off at the local level, but the permit is issued at the state level. And so we're really coming together between the department and local governments to share lessons learned in terms of smart cities and project descriptions. Data management is obviously a key issue, and so sharing that information. The availability of safety and traffic information, as well as interoperability. And so really providing a forum for ideas to be shared, for experiences to be shared, and for everybody to learn from those lessons as we move forward and figure out how we can continue to improve going forward. So that's what we have from Maryland's perspective, and I will wait to the end to see if there's any other questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chrissy.
Thank you.
And so our final update we have from Amanda from Virginia. Amanda, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'll go quick since I know I'm the last one. I imagine only a few of you have met me. I am the new Virginia Lingham here in Virginia, so I'm the new Connected and Automated Vehicle Program Manager working out of our Office of Strategic Innovation. As someone mentioned earlier, that office was designed to allow and encourage an understanding of innovation and how to integrate all that into the department's activities as a whole. And so I will get started on the next slide, please. So Virginia does not have any legislation or regulation that is specifically designed to address automated vehicles. As a result, our current traffic laws apply. And so owner and / operators, depending on the situation, are responsible for determining whether or not their vehicle is in compliance with Virginia laws. Now, obviously, they will come to us for access to our smart roads for testing or to our connected quarters for testing. They reach out to DMV for registration. But there's a lot for the owner operators to sort of look at and understand in Virginia, and we help them as they do that. I will point out that we are receiving more and more research requests from other states and national entities looking at regulation, and we've responded to a couple of DOTs and some universities as well on sort of what Virginia's setup of not having regulation or legislation has led to, which I thought was very timely for this particular talk today. And then we just, as part of all of this on the legislation and regulation side, are keeping an eye on what the national trends are. But as of yet, there's not been much push in Virginia for either regulation or legislation. Next slide. So I focused specifically for this on what the obstacles and the lessons learned have been, specifically when it comes to us having a lack of legislation and or regulation in this area. Oddly enough, the lack of legislation or regulation has led to a lot of flexibility between our universities, between local pilots. We don't have a set process, so we can really adapt to whatever the current trend is, whatever the current interest is, which has been very interesting and useful a lot of the time because the technology moves so quickly. But with that flexibility comes the requirement that agencies have to be very adaptable. And for that to work, there has to be very good communication between government entities, research institutions, and industry. And we are currently working on our own strategic plan that is going to help solidify a lot of those communication and coordination structures to continue to support Virginia's activities. Next slide. So for our next steps that we're focusing on, we're going to continue to develop our connected corridors, potentially looking at SPAT developments. There's constant testing going on about how the RSUs and OBEs are working and what amount of data we're getting and latencies. It's a very fascinating and very fast-moving field. As I mentioned earlier, we're working on developing our strategic plan that should come out by the end of the year. We are talking a great deal internally and with our pilot projects about how we prepare for and manage CAV data. I was in a meeting earlier today that mentioned that we may be in place for a tsunami of data to come from all of these very high-level computers on wheels that will be talking to us and us talking to them, and how we provide the backup channels like fiber, et cetera, to support all of that data movement is something we've put a lot of effort into. Still lots of work figuring out how to use CAVs to improve safety and mobility. We've got a couple of different pilot shuttles going on. One's wrapping up at a joint base, Myers-Henderson Hall with Ollie. That was looking at moving soldiers and base guests across the base because, as you can imagine, some bases are quite large, and some of the soldiers, particularly if they're moving between deployments, may not have a vehicle. So there's a lot of effort to move them efficiently, as well as to allow them to have more access off base. And so we've been helping them on that project, and we have another one that is looking at adding a automated shuttle in Fairfax County, looking to try and add service between a metro station and a shopping center, and kind of that first last mile examples. The county's interested to see how that goes, and the pilot will likely run for about a year. So that leads into the next thing I have on our list, which is supporting regional pilots. We also, in addition to all of those, we have some other research institutes that have their own shuttles that they're running, UVA and BCCI. So we've been talking back and forth with them. And then Daimler recently announced that they've started their automated trucking testing along the I-81 corridor out of Virginia. So we've been working with them about the specific issues that come with automation and the commercial vehicle sphere. And finally, we're working on increasing public awareness of getting their engagement and their feedback about what their fears are and what their needs are from these vehicles. And I think that's me, and hopefully I wrapped up fast enough.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Amanda. So at this point, it looks like we don't have any recent questions from the audience. We do have a few polling questions. So Joanna, maybe we can move into that. And as folks are answering these polling questions for all of you, we could, continue to throw any questions you have in the chat box. And of course, if you want to follow up later with any of our speakers, that is fine as well. But we've got a couple polling questions for you that you can go ahead and chime in on. And I guess as soon as we stop seeing answers coming in, we will move on to the next one. And we're probably about there, right? Great. And then the second question is more about that workshop I mentioned that we're planning for the spring of 2020. We just love your input on the types of topics you'd like to see us dig in.
Jenna, this is Joanna. I think also, folks, as you're completing this polling question, if there is any other if there are any other topics, you can put them in the chat box, but you can certainly reach out to Jenna at any time, and she'll be happy to take that information. Right, Jenna?
Yes, absolutely. We're definitely, as we're starting to plan, we're looking for input from everybody about how to make that time most valuable. Okay, that looks like we've got our answers there. Thank you. And I see we have at least one person typing. But while we're waiting, there's a couple more ideas for that. And so I'll just quickly make one more announcement that I forgot to mention earlier on. And Greg had brought up the topic of the recent ADS grant awards, and I just wanted to share with everyone that the Coalition is a member of one of those awards. We're part of the team that's led from the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute that's looking at mixed-use fleets for motor carriers and doing some work around that area. And so the Coalition is one of those members. Will be on the steering committee, and we're really excited because for two reasons. One, this kind of brings together our intermodal freight work that we've done and been really involved in for the whole 25 years that the Coalition's been in existence, bringing that into our CAV program and bridging that gap there, as well as the fact that this project really tackles that sort of immediate need and reality around this technology, which is going to be this sort of next fleet model. And so we're excited to be part of that. We look forward to continuing to engage our members to get input from all of you at the practitioner level, and we'll certainly be updating you as that project gets underway, and we have more to share about that. So again, thank you to all of our presenters today and for all of you participating and being involved. And our contact information, please reach out to me if you want to. The slides will be available within a week or so. We'll get an update